Good evening. Hi, Katie. Thank you so much for the introduction, and as always, a shout out to the Calgary Library. My name is Alan Donsky. I'm going to be the host for this evening and the moderator. I will just say a few introductory remarks here about who we are as a group, and then also help out when Phil's talk is done during the Q&A session at the end. This presentation is offered this evening through a local group called Wellness Through Mindfulness, and we started up about 6 years ago. And we used to meet twice a month in person, but we've no longer done that with COVID. And so the hosting has happened through the graces of the CPL. And we want to thank Katie, and in particular also Patrick Mealy and other hosts who've helped us out for the evenings. We've got a website called www.thebreathproject.org, and on that site we have got a lot of resources, videos, and recordings of previous sessions, and lots of recommendations for that. We currently offer Zoom presentations twice a month on the first and third Thursdays of the month from 7 till 8:30 p.m. You can register on the CPL website or additionally through the Wellness Through Mindfulness website. I want to put in a word for some upcoming presentations. In 2 weeks' time, on the 20th, we've got a wonderful talk by Nicole Libben on mindfulness for parenting, and that is a highly recommended one as well. Nicole's a great speaker, has published a number of books. All this information is on the website. And then 2 weeks after that, Thursday, June the 3rd, The Joy of Effort. And we always like these interesting titles for topics because Leslie Ellistat, who is a leader and a speaker and teacher of WTM, The Joy of Effort. And so that's also promising to be an interesting talk. And then thirdly, on our website, you'll also see that Leslie is offering a day-long retreat on Sunday, May the 16th, on loving kindness meditation. And that topic, of course, is very timely given how much non-gentility people can have towards themselves or others at the moment. So Leslie's retreat will be a respite. The evening is structured with a talk by Phil. We'll wrap up at about 8 p.m. And then we've got a full half an hour for question, answer, conversation, and discussion. If people wish to speak up loud, they can through the audio, but just bear in mind that you will be recorded, or your voice will be recorded, but not your name. Or else you can post questions in the chat room, as I mentioned earlier. And you know about the chat logo. And it's being recorded, and please check that your mic is muted at this point again. I'd like to say a few words of introduction for our wonderful speaker this evening. I first met Phil 14 years ago at a retreat, and Phil has always presented as a strong practitioner. He's a believer and he practices what he preaches. And most of all, that mindfulness is an ongoing experience. It's an ongoing learning. It's lifelong. It's not something that you kind of get and understand intellectually. So as a practice, we have to do this. Phil discovered as a gastroenterologist of many years standing, and he told me the story once that the first question he asked when patients come in to speak about their gut problems, he would say, "What was going on in your life at the time when your GI symptoms started?" And 70% of the time, Phil said, there were major issues, stresses, irritations, life changes, etc. And Phil realized very deeply that unless he addressed the stress in people's lives, their GI symptoms would not get any better. He could be technically wonderful, do all the right investigations, but this is what led him to also publishing a book, which is called Mindfulness Medication, the Physician's Prescription for Stress Relief. This book is available as a free download, or you can also get it as a paperback if you want a hard copy. Phil was instrumental in starting up the WTM group and has been a leader and a strong advocate for this, has kept us going when some of us had flagging spirits. And it really is a pleasure to introduce Phil this evening. And I can't excuse the pun, wait for his talk. So I'll just hand it over to you, Phil. Thank you very much. I'm excited to be here and introduce you as a good friend and colleague.
Thanks for your kind introduction, Alan. It's a real pleasure to be here this evening and to share with you my understanding and insights that I have developed over a 25-year practice of mindfulness, and that is still evolving. The Buddha said,
ladies just took a bath in the retro dish.
Katie?
Sorry about that. I muted that person.
Can you put me into the middle of the screen, though, please?
I believe you are spotlighted, Phil.
Don't see it. I just see you in the middle of my screen, Katie.
Just give me one moment here.
I have you in the middle of mine, Phil, and I pinned you. So
Okay.
I don't know.
All right, well, we'll just carry on and we'll just see what happens. So it's a great pleasure to be here this evening, because what I wanted to do is to share with you my insights that have developed over the last 25 years in this practice. Because I don't think that one ever reaches the end of a mindfulness practice. It just becomes a constant.
Okay, yeah, we usually finish up in about 8:30.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to mute this person, but
Right
they keep
on. Talk
unmuting
to you
themselves.
then.
I'm so
Bye-bye.
sorry. Please mute yourselves, everyone. And Phil,
This is okay. I'm in the middle of the screen. Just send Don a note in the chat to mute himself. So the Buddha said, don't take what I have to say as the truth. I want you to explore it, to see if it works for you. And this is my advice for the talk that I'm going to give to you tonight. That listen to what I have to say, but then examine it. Does it work for you? Is it important? Can you modify it? And can you make it even better for yourself? I've always thought that the term mindfulness is a very limiting word to describe what's going on. When you say the word mindfulness, what comes to mind is mind. But in reality, mindfulness is really a path of wholesomeness, wholefulness, that incorporates not only your mind, but your feelings and your physical sensations. I see wholefulness as an integrative path that starts at the point of contact, how you deal with it, how you're in relationship with it, and how you respond to it. I think this is very, very important to understand, that mindfulness is just not about enhanced attention to know what is going on, but it is a process of changing the relationship with what you are dealing with. I see mindfulness as awareness with engaged discernment, leading to non-attachment with a sense of self and skillful action. So there are multiple components. Awareness, can you engage with it? Can you bring inquiry and insight? And the segue of freedom of mindfulness is not being non-judgmental. The segue of freedom of mindfulness is non-attachment with a sense of self, leading to skillful action. I'd like to share with you one word that I feel encapsulates this entire process and can be of value for you to bring to mind when you are faced moment to moment with your experience. And that word is wait. So wait stands for, what am I thinking? What am I touching? Why am I thinking this? And what am I trying to do? So let's explore this path. So when something charged comes up in your consciousness, the first thing you say to yourself is wait. What does wait stand for? Pause, stop. Because when you get overwhelmed in the moment, you're out of control. You have no self-regulation. And your brain, that higher cortical functioning center, goes offline. There's a part of your body called the thalamus in your brain that controls the flow of information from the periphery up into your higher centers. And that goes offline. And there's no way that you can communicate, you can talk to yourself in that moment. And there are only two ways that you can connect with yourself when you are stressed out. And that is with your breath and your body. That these are the vehicles of initially stabilizing this overreactive nervous system. So let's look at the breath. And I call this the ABCDE of breathing. You know, I've given a talk on this, and it's on our WTM website, and you can go there and you can view the whole talk. But in summary, can you A, bring awareness, B, C, breathe calmly, D, breathe diaphragmatically from your belly, and you can enforce that by putting your hand on your belly and have that hand rise and fall. And finally, E, exhalation. The breath is magical. It has the capacity to influence what is called the parasympathetic nervous system of the autonomic nervous system. The reason why that's so important is it leads to relaxation. So when you get charged, the first thing you do is bring your awareness to your breath. Breathe calmly, breathe from your belly, and emphasize exhalation such that you breathe out 1 second longer than you breathe in. And do this until you've calmed down, or you've done 5 breaths, or you've done 1 breath, in and out for a count of 4 and out for 6. The other way you can stabilize yourself when you're charged is to connect with your body. That also brings you into the present moment. You know, most of us hold our attention in our face and in our torso. And where are we neutral? Well, usually it's the bottom of our feet, our hands, and our buttocks. So when you get charged, when you're losing control, bring your awareness to the bottom of your feet, to your hands and your buttock, and just rest in those physical sensations to ground you into the present moment. So first thing, say wait, pause, and rest either in your breath or in your body. Next, what am I thinking? And in essence, what we're talking about here is awareness. And I say that one should smile to awareness. Smile? Well, this contains the components of intentional and sustained meta-awareness, labeling, and evoked cues. So let's explore that. Just bring awareness to whatever arises in your consciousness right now. What are you aware of? My voice speaking, Maybe your mind wandering. Maybe you're thinking about something in the past or something in the future. Maybe you're drinking something or eating something, or maybe there's a pain in your back. The bottom line is that we all have the capacity to be aware, unless we're in a coma or dead. That for most of us, this is stimulus driven, whatever is dominant. And we have the capacity to be aware because it's a natural and physiologic process. Second, we have the capacity to be intentional about our awareness. And so focus your awareness on your breath. Just feel the sensations of the movement of the breath. And now bring awareness to sound. Just be open to what you hear. And so again, this demonstrates clearly that yes, mindfulness, that awareness can be open, but we have the capacity to be intentional, and we have the capacity to sustain our awareness. And this is really a very important component of what awareness is in mindfulness. It really is that ability to sustain awareness until what we are aware of fades into stillness and silence. Labeling. Labeling is the capacity to name what we are experiencing. Dan Siegel says, name it to tame it. Matthew Lieberman in brain scan, MRI scanning demonstrated that when you could put your emotions into words, your feelings into words, this actually created changes in the capacity of your brain to self-regulate and decrease the center of anxiety and fear. One can label in a very generic sense: thinking, feeling, physical sensation. One can be more specific. Now sadness, now pain, now fear. And if one wants to take this to even a more direct connection with mindfulness, because mindfulness is a process. It is not a state that you arrive at. You say, knowing and what your experience is, knowing sadness, knowing fear, knowing pain. So the significance of this is that we are labeling our experience without the sense of self. It's not, I am sad. And it's labeling experience as a process. So the value of labeling is that in order to label, we need to have stepped back from our experience. We need to have had reflection on it, and we need to have observed it. And this is called meta-awareness, which means to know what you know. I am sad, I am angry, but I know that I am sad and I am angry. I don't know about you, but when I really get worked up and I'm angry or sad or fearful, all I know is that I am angry. I'm just this anger, but there is absolutely no capacity for reflection. And so the value of meta-awareness is that it supports awareness. It supports it supports meta-awareness, and it supports disidentification. So if there is one key aspect that you can learn from tonight, I would suggest it's learning how to label your experience. And it is a wonderful way to bring you present and to be able to step back and disidentify. And so whenever you're conscious of something, basically state knowing sadness, knowing fear. This is an invaluable tool of mindfulness. And I hope that you start to employ it as a way to support your practice. The last aspect is evoked cues. You know, we would all be aware, we would all be conscious of what we're doing if we had only could remember to do it. So how do we enhance the capacity to be aware of what we're trying to do? Cues, reminders, such that when this cue goes off, it says to you, what's going on? And then you can choose either what's dominant in the moment or whatever you choose to be aware of. So cues can be Post-it notes. Cues can be alarms on your phone, alarms on your watch, apps on your phone, or what we call physical cues. In other words, you choose a physical activity during the day that becomes your reminder to stop and pause and be aware. Before or after you answer your phone or send a text, or when you eat, or when you go to the bathroom, or when you're standing in line, that this is the cue to remind you to pause and become aware. So, remember, label your experience as a process to bring awareness to the moment. Next, what am I touching? And this is about embodied engagement. Most of us live disembodied. We live from our neck up. And the function of the body is to support the head. That's it. Well, this is a real problem because the body has so much to teach us. When we experience a sensation in the body, it's just not a physical feeling, a physical sensation. What we think, what we feel emotionally, and what we feel physically are interconnected. So when we feel something in our body, this can be a message of what we are thinking and feeling in the moment. There's only one place where the body can be, here and now. Unlike our thinking minds that can be in the past, in the future. And very valuably, when we experienced trauma, even before we had the capacity for language, this was stored in our body. And we carry that traumatic history in our body right to the present moment. And having the capacity to understand and feel our body is the capacity to feel our trauma. And as we said before, sometimes the only way we can communicate with our self and our trauma is through the body, not verbally. And the one other invaluable aspect of the body is that it is a direct, authentic representation of what we are experiencing. Unlike our minds that tends to elaborate, interpret, and judge everything, the body is a direct, authentic expression of what is going on in the moment. So the body is invaluable. We need to start to become engaged with it way more often than we do. So when we experience sensations in our body, this can be in two ways. It can be a somatic and a visceral sense. Somatic means that sort of very direct, focused, acute aspect. You know that feeling you have when you hit your shin against the fence and it is painful. But there's another capacity of sensation that is called visceral. It's a very sort of indirect, diffuse, amorphous, unlocalized way to feel your experience. Chief Justice Potter of the US Supreme Court was asked to define pornography. And he said, you know, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. And I think this is a very nice illustration of what the visceral felt sense of experience is. That you know something. You know that feeling when you're in love, that when you're angry, and when you're frightened. And it's that sort of that feeling that you get that you just can't describe, but you know what it is. Some people practice getting in touch with their body through what's called the body scan. And this is a formalized practice of bringing awareness to the body. And we have a very delightful, wonderful body scan as a meditation on the WTM website. So when you get upset and when you get agitated, you need to remember to turn towards the body, because most of us innately will run away from the body. And what you want to do ultimately, if it is possible, is to connect and to feel intimately that hot spot, that spot where that visceral and somatic feeling is. But this is not so easy to do, because as you get close to that hot spot, you don't want to go there, because in some subconscious way, it's reminding you of previous trauma. So when you get agitated and you bring your attention to the body, there are two ways to approach this. You can just do a sort of a general body scan and see where you're feeling your tension and try and bring your awareness to it. Or you can start by bringing your awareness to the soles of your feet, neutral, and gradually ascend your awareness up your body to as close as you can get to that hot spot. And maybe you can't get there, or maybe you get there, but you only last a second, and then you fall back. And you can go through this process of oscillation, getting as close as you can to your hot spot, and then falling back to a neutral place. But becoming aware of the body is an essential part of mindfulness, because mindfulness is not about enhanced awareness, but it is a relational process. Do we have the capacity to be present with what is, with an open heart and compassion? And if we could just be with all our experience physically and stay with it and be with it until it fades away into stillness and nothingness, then we would be practicing mindfulness. And our bodies that have this tremendous intelligence have the capacity to process, to metabolize, to digest our suffering. So why can't we do that? Why can't we be with our pain, with our suffering, with our thoughts? 2,600 years ago, the Buddha said, anything I attach to as I, me, or mine leads to suffering. It was this unbelievable insight that we construct a sense of self, that we identify with the sense of self, and that we take on our pain and our suffering that causes us to suffer. That mindfulness, at its essence, is not non-judgmental. At its essence, it's non-attachment with the sense of self. So, why am I thinking this? Discernment. And I have to tell you that in my practice of mindfulness, bringing Western psychologic inquiry into the understanding of how I construct myself has been a critical segue to freedom. That it has been this capacity for what I call cognitive mindfulness, the bringing together of Western insight and Eastern holding of the pain and the suffering, that has been the greatest capacity for me to move further. So what I want to talk about is a very broad topic, and I'm just going to try and highlight the essence so that we have an understanding of how we construct our sense of self that gives us the tool to let go of it. I lost my keys. And in 1 second, or even not that long, my mind is saying to me, oh my God, how could I have lost the keys? This is terrible. I have made such a mistake. I'll never find those keys. I am so hopeless. How could I have done this? I'll never be able to drive my car again. I'll never get the key. I'll never be able to get into my house again. I won't have a key. Do you ever have those times of self-talk where your mind says things to you that you would never say to anybody else in this world? And we all do this, that we all create meaning in our experience. And so I like to call this MR, event, meaning making, relationship, and response. And it is this capacity to understand how we create our sense of self moment to moment that is the key, the segue to freedom. So an event comes along. Are we ever just with what happens? Absolutely not. We create meaning about everything. Everything is referenced against a belief system that we hold about who we believe we are. This is Phil. This is the way he should behave. This is how he should act. And if he doesn't, this is the consequences. And this is what he needs to do to be sure he is safe. So every event comes along, we create meaning. It is referenced against a belief system that represents what is called this autobiographical sense of self, who we believe we are. Have I acted in a way that is congruent or incongruent with my belief system? I am judged. Am I good or am I bad? Associated with that self-judgment is this feeling, tone, this felt body sense, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. And along with that comes a preference. Is this something I want or I don't want? And then I become aware of the fact that my mind is talking to me. It's telling me I'm terrible for losing the keys. Well, let me see. My mind is talking to me. Who else would be talking to me if it wasn't me talking to myself? Therefore, the mind that talks to me and the sense of self that I create has to be me. So what we end up doing is we end up identifying with the sense of self that is created in the moment. All of us have created defensive strategies in order to feel that we're okay, defensive strategies to deal with how we feel inadequate. So every moment of our existence, of our life, we are referencing what is occurring against our held belief system, judging ourselves, and then creating a strategy in order to deal with that deficiency. So where does this belief system come from? It's not something that I was born with. I didn't come into life saying, this is Phil and this is who he is. We come into this world. We are powerless. We are defenseless. We are very dependent upon our caregivers, our parents, in order to interpret what life is and in order to interpret who we are. That we feel we, as these defenseless children, are responsible for whatever goes amiss. If there's a problem, I did it. And so our sense of identity is given to us by our caregivers and is further reinforced by ongoing psychological, societal, cultural standards that reflect on who we are. When I was growing up in my house, my mother ruled the house. It was her way or the highway. There are certain ways you behaved and certain ways you didn't behave. And it was to try and meet her needs. So, what did I think about myself? Be invisible. Don't stand up. Don't go against the status quo. Please appease, because that meant acceptance and love. And so what was my coping strategy? That was very simple. If I was perfect and there were no mistakes, then I was safe. So losing the keys triggered this historic memory for me. Understanding how we construct our reality based on our belief system, I believe, is instrumental in learning how to disidentify. And one can do this in asking yourself 3 simple questions. What actually happened? For me, losing the key. Simple as that. Nothing else. Not I was bad, not this was terrible, but the simple act of what actually happened is I lost the key. Next, what does this mean about me? And when I ask that question, this is not from the perspective of me as the adult losing the key and what that means, but what does that mean about me is asking, what does that mean about me as that child, that core wounding? I lost the key. This is terrible. I'm not perfect. There's something that I fear about doing this, that I have done something that's not right. And why? Because I had a belief system that said I needed to be perfect to be loved. So I like to invite you to explore this possibility in terms of how you create your belief system, that what directs you on a moment-to-moment basis. But let me preface this by saying, we're going to explore our child, and that all of us to a certain degree have been traumatized one way or the other. Some have been traumatized more than others. And so please be aware, if you feel reliving a childhood memory is going to re-traumatize you, don't do this exercise. Put the sound volume down, and when we're finished the exercise, I'll raise my hand and invite you back. But please, I'm inviting you to be very careful. So, I'd invite you all just to sit up in your chair, close your eyes, and think back to when you were a child. Picture yourself. How would you describe yourself? What did you believe about yourself? How did you have to act in your family? And what was expected? What were you scared of? And what did you feel you needed but never got from your parents or caregivers? And what did you do? How did you act to try and compensate for that feeling of perhaps not feeling safe or loved or worthy? And now bring to mind a current memory of when you felt judged, criticized, angry, upset. And let us examine this with these 3 questions in terms of this current experience. What actually happened? No judgment, no associations. What actually happened? What does this mean about me as that wounded child? And why is that? What is that underlying core belief about who you believe you are? I think that this demonstrates that although we live, quote, in the present moment as an adult right now, that much of what we think and act is in service of our wounding, of our childhood wounding, that we live through that narrative. And in understanding why we do what we do, by understanding how we construct our belief system, that what is alive in us in this moment is critical, is crucial to freedom. And I've turned this into a formal practice, that I find a time in the day when I'm settled, not agitated, settled, either as its own time or in combination with my formal meditation practice. And I bring to mind, I relive a memory of an event that may have happened today or yesterday. And I ask those 3 questions. And you know what turns up? The same answers. And I find that personally, when this has been done as a repetitive practice, the same story keeps getting played and played. And ultimately, you recondition yourself, and your mind just knows what is happening now. And so I think this experiment, this exercise, this understanding of how we create our sense of self is invaluable. We recognize that there is nothing solid, that there's nothing enduring about the self, that it is constructed moment to moment, dependent upon how the current circumstances trigger an unmet need. That the sense of self, thank you, I'm sorry I forgot to invite you back. That it is crucial to understand that the sense of self is not an enduring, persistent structure. That we have the capacity to see how unmet needs from our childhood wounding surface moment to moment. And that the sense of self is just a defensive strategy. It is a coping mechanism that we create moment to moment. So why identify with something that isn't truly who you are? That there is something that is being created moment to moment. That there is a self. It is real and true. But the sense of self is not who I am at my core. And this is the segue to freedom. So lastly, what am I trying to do? We're looking at relationship. And the key point here is not about relationship with the present moment. It's a relationship with the sense of self. And second, response. So let's look at relationship. And so we can be in relationship in many ways. When you think about your breath that is neutral or a body sensation that is neutral, there's no sense of self. It's just a sensation that is known. When we think of somebody that we care for and we love and our heart opens to them, we are there in a very compassionate, loving capacity. And when we're with someone we don't like, or when our minds are critical and judgmental, we are present from a place of avoidance, denial, resistance, anger, judgment. What we're trying to do with mindfulness is to be in a relationship with the sense of self from a place that is open, accepting, and compassionate. Well, who are you the least compassionate with? Self or other? I would say that it is very difficult for one to be compassionate with your sense of who you believe you are. And our goal is to try and create self-compassion. So why can't we do this? So what is it that is offering compassion to your sense of self? It's this sort of awareness, this mindfulness. But the problem is when what is offering compassion is the same as what the compassion is directed to, is the same as what is suffering, then it is impossible to offer compassion to yourself. Because you are both tormentor and tormented at the same time. Compassion, feeling with acting for. In other words, we need to be in relationship with something, someone else, in order for the pain and suffering of other to touch our heart. That when we are identified with what is suffering, we suffer. So what is the strategy that you can use that allows you to offer self-compassion, that allows you not to attach to the sense of self? And this goes back to what we explored with discernment, that the essence of self is an attempt to meet the unmet needs of the wounded child. That at its core, our woundings, our feelings of inadequacies is the basis for creation of the self to protect ourselves. So the strategy I offer for you is how to look at your sense of self as your wounded child. We're going to do another experiment. And again, for those people who have a history that may not allow them to approach their sense, for those of you who have a sense of history that may be traumatized, I ask you not to choose your sense of self as offering the compassion to. but I will give you another choice. So we can start off by choosing one sense of self. And if that is too problematic, then choose someone who you care for deeply. Another child, your own child, your grandchild, a friend, your partner, sibling, your pet. And bring that image to mind. And see how in that moment, when they are in pain or suffering, how do they look? What might they be thinking? What might they be feeling? And what are they feeling physically? And allow yourself to then turn your awareness to yourself. And when you look at that wounded child that is you, that wounded child that is someone else, that wounded friend, that wounded animal, what does it bring out in you? How does it touch your heart? And what do you want to offer to that person you care for deeply? I have an image of myself when I was, probably 5 or 6, standing at the door. And it was a particular moment when I truly did not feel that I was loved or I was lovable. And I can see my child as I was at that time. And I can see that heaviness, that collapsed feeling, that sense of thoughts and physicality and that heaviness that was going through my child at that time. And it evokes in me this desire to just kneel down and to hold my child and to rock my child back and forth and to give my child a kiss on the face and say, I love you. It's okay to feel scared. It's okay to feel sad. I am here for you. I will listen to you. I will take care of you. I will protect you. And I will love you. And so we have this capacity to open our hearts to ourself. If we see ourselves as our wounded child or someone else we care for that is suffering and in pain. And again, I think this can be very valuable to make this into a formal practice, where when there is a time when you're settled and not agitated, to allow yourself to bring to mind this anchoring image, this wounded person, and allow your heart to be touched and evoked by what you see. So that over time, this becomes something that is more spontaneous when your self starts to talk to you and is self-critical and is self-judgmental. And so what happens is that as mindfulness hears, holds, and honors the wounding of our child, there is the beginning of healing of that sadness. that the child knows it is heard, that it is safe, and that there is slowly a disentanglement from one's feelings of unworthiness, that there is a sense of support that is present, and that the sense of self starts to slowly evolve, and that there is a greater capacity for awareness to come into place. And as we begin to transition from being able to act not in defense of our wounded ego, but from a non-personalized locus, we then begin to have the capacity to open our hearts up to other, so that we operate from a place of interconnectedness, altruism, morality, compassion, rather than protecting the sense of self. That we have the capacity to rest in awareness that knows the experience that contains the story of self, rather than being the sense of self that is having the experience. So we'll close here. I'd like to thank you for listening. I hope there was something of value. There were multiple things that were offered. And maybe this is something that needs to be relived and re-listened to. So now I'm going to turn this over to Alan, who is our moderator, and we look forward to answering all of the questions. And just to say that if there are more questions than we have time for, in other words, that extend beyond 8:30, our plan is to formally end the evening at 8:30, but then we will continue on to answer all the questions that you would like us to answer. So Alan, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you for just allowing some real presence as, and I'm sure everybody is, just taking in the vista that you've given us here, Phil. You've covered the breadth of the human experience, from the physicality of it through the moments where we're triggered. You've covered the recognition that we carry with us woundedness, and just that sense of depth that you've provided us here tonight, Bill. And to bring it right back, I think you've given the herald promotional talk for why we started Wellness Through Mindfulness in the first place. And the word well and the word whole and the word heal is central to what we're really trying to do. And you really captured it tonight, that sense that mindfulness is much more than just paying attention on purpose in the moment without judgment. That in fact, it's a continual process that is iterative, and that as we lean into things instead of pulling away from the places that hurt, as we lean into it, in fact, what is needed, and you touched on it and summarized it beautifully, Phil, that what's needed is the sense of that you are the big Phil. I'll call you the big Phil. And there's little Phil who's hurting and frightened. And there's big Alan who can talk to little Alan. And I had an image of myself as a 6-year-old. And these exercises are very helpful because you can also give that child the relief of not having to carry all that burden, the relief of not having to be perfect anymore. So not only do we heal those past wounds, we heal ourselves of the baggage that we carry into adulthood. So I really want to thank you for that. Just allowing all of this to really settle in. I remind everyone again, they have the options of speaking live if you want to raise your hand, and we can have you unmuted.
Alan, for 1 second, Katie.
Yeah.
You're not coming up on the chat here. When Alan is speaking, can you spotlight him, please? Thank you.
Sure. Yes, I sent you a message in the chat about that exact thing. Let me do that.
Yeah. There's a person who I won't mention because this is recorded, but it's in the chat room, and this person has said to everybody, I used to be like that till 2009. I had to be perfect every time I screwed up, Phil. I get so mad at myself. I've been a real people pleaser since that time. So when people suffered a little bit because of me, I felt so horrible about it. And then somebody else asked this person, how did you overcome it? And they said, by getting unbrainwashed and realizing that I was too hard on myself all the time. And then somebody else, and this is your question, Phil, for those who have the same issues, how would you advise they resolve being too hard on themselves? So the question, Phil, is how do you advise people they resolve being too hard on themselves? That's the question.
So the first thing is to recognize that mindfulness is one process, that there are multiple ways to deal with our wounding and our trauma. That for some, perhaps mindfulness may not even be appropriate. Certainly if there's been a history of PTSD, psychosis, suicidal ideations. So that's the first thing, is to recognize that there are multiple ways to address one's difficulty. Second, this is a long process, that you have lived with your history, that you've lived with your narrative for as long as you've been alive. They say that we begin to start to create a sense of identity by age 4, that our trauma is trapped pre-verbally in our bodies. And so I think that the other part is to recognize that whatever path you do follow, it is a long path. It requires perseverance, patience, and not this immediate sense of gratification. That I do believe that most of us are good enough. That most of us can offer a sense of our own healer. And that we can offer comfort and support to who we are. And yes, there is a percentage of people who definitely need professional help. So what I'm offering is something that I see is good enough for most of us, but not all of us. And I think that this capacity to create a practice out of these ideas is the key. You just can't say, okay, this is my belief system, goodbye. This is something that needs to be relived and revisited time and time again, such that what we end up doing is we decondition what we're conditioned to, and we recondition it to a different type of conditioning, so that we may never change our story, that it may always live within us, but that we have the capacity to be in a different relationship with it. And this is the key of mindfulness, that pain and suffering is what we create. It is what we superimpose. There is nothing inherently that has value except what we put on it. So the essence of mindfulness, it is not a state that you get to. It is an ongoing dynamic dance between the current moment and the historic story. And I think for myself that when I made this into a practice, that I would find a time when I was stabilized, that I could relive a memory, that I had done the work of identifying my belief system and my woundings, that I could bring a current moment into play and ask, what actually happened? What does this mean about me and why? And then in response to that, I have the capacity to bring this child, this adult, this animal that evokes compassion in you. And then I am able to then bring this compassion to who I believe I am. So I just, that's what I think is really important, that this is a process that goes like this, and that you just don't get there and you stay there, that you fall and you come up and you go down. Thanks, Alan.
And another one, Paul, another question. Are there ways or strategies you can offer to identify with the wounded child, or strategies to recall what your little self's unmet needs were?
So again, it's very important from the outset, because there may be some traumatic memories that we have that we may not be prepared to revisit without support professionally. And so we need to be careful to have a clear understanding of what our history is. And sometimes that history is not clear. That a lot of our coping adult mechanisms may, the defensive strategies, the self-soothing behaviors reflected in addictive behaviors may often reflect significant wounding that's gone on underneath. That certainly when I, in my clinical practice, would see people who came to see me with chronic history of abdominal pain that had multiple surgeries, multiple tests, and nothing was ever found. The red light went on for me. And often it was really trying to identify if there was perhaps a history of sexual abuse that had gone on in that child, that the child that the adult was at one point in time. And so I'm suggesting a way of doing this, but bearing in mind that there are memories that may not surface or may surface without invitation. And I keep coming back to persistence. And I want to share a story because I think this truly reflects what mindfulness is for me. I've been practicing mindfulness for 25 years, and I probably didn't have a good sense of what it was all about until the last 10 years. And for me, I experimented and I discovered that truly understanding how the sense of self was a reflection of my inner child core wounding was pivotal. So in the beginning, it was a sense of anxiety, obsession, the typical thing that we all deal with. And I began to meditate, and I began to bring mindfulness to the process. And slowly over time, there was a change, that I began to recognize the repetitiveness of the same story that I would hear moment to moment. And I have to honestly say that there has been, for me, a tremendous reward of mindfulness and meditation, a much greater sense of stability, lack of reactivity, and resilience. But I want to share a story of what I think mindfulness truly is. And I call this my Gabor Mate moment. So Gabor Mate is a physician who is in Vancouver. And he is an addiction physician. He often talked about how underlying childhood wounding was reflected moment to moment. So Gabor Mate was born in Hungary. And when he was 1 year old, the Nazis had invaded. And his mother gave him to another woman who was not Jewish, because if she was going to be caught, she did not want her child to be killed. Well, 1 year later, things changed and she got her child back. He came to Canada. He became a physician. He got married. He had issues in aspects of his life. And as I listened to this podcast, there was this absolutely deep resonance with his story. It touched something profoundly deep and raw within me. And there was just this sense of knowing that what I needed to do was to turn to this sense of sadness and intimately feel it in my body. And there was no sense of I am sad, and there was no sense of I know what is being felt. It was a non-thinking knowing of experience. And for me, I think this is truly what mindfulness is. This sense of simply being with what is without any need of identifying with it, any need to change it, except to be one with the experience, but not the one who is having the experience.
Thank you very much, Paul. And this is also reminds me so much of how just at a very instinctive level, we tend to run away from anything that's unpleasant. We spoke about it earlier, the pleasant, the unpleasant, and the neutral. And so as an instinct, we want to run from it. But in fact, the path to the healing is to actually be with it. And so that first leaning into it, as you say, is exactly the first order of business. And to be able to hold that with mindfulness, to hold that pain, hold the suffering, hold the woundedness in our heart. Because when we wall it off, we also wall off all the yummy stuff. We talk about the yummy and the yucky stuff. So when I try and wall off my wounded heart, I can't access the very things that we need: grace, love, kindness, gentility, hugging, the beauty or joy or connection. So the very place that we find the healing is right in the wound. I read a quote the other day. It's a new one. It's a beautiful one. There was a student at the, and there was a monk, and the student, he said, I've seen you get very angry. I've seen you get very angry, oh great teacher. So all the stuff you're talking about, right? Non-judgment and being and all of this. And the teacher said, yes, I do get very angry. But the thing is, I don't do anything with it. And I just love that, because it's exactly what you said, just in different words, to be with it without labeling yourself as I am angry, or this is my anger, or getting caught up in some story about why I am or why I'm not. I'll add another comment. There isn't a question here at the moment. If anybody else has other questions, please put them in the chat box. Just to highlight, and this has come up through the last 5 years of our meetings, that mindfulness is a helpful way of being, and it is a process. And as somebody wrote here, Phil, it's ongoing and it's never completely done. And just to remind folks that mindfulness is not the same as therapy. You cannot meditate yourself out of therapy. And that it can be very, very complementary. And that you, just as you need help to do your taxes sometime, or you need a mechanic to help you with your car, just because this is deeply personal, to be very, very careful of doing what's called spiritual bypass, where if I just meditate enough and I just send myself good wishes, it'll be enough. Because sometimes you need that holding presence of somebody else that can help you navigate the dark places in very loving, capable, competent ways. So good intentions are sometimes not sufficient. And so we're not suggesting that mindfulness is a replacement for therapy when called for. It can be an integral part. And in fact, there are many therapies which are based on mindfulness practices. So just to highlight that for people, we're not, don't try and bypass your woundedness, because you may actually do yourself more damage, because you may bring things up that you're not quite knowing what to do with. So you don't represent yourself in court either.
Yeah, I think that's a very valuable point, that one can try and do this practice and one can use one's, quote, spiritual identity. The sense of self is not real. It is an illusion. And then there is a denial of all that core wounding that went on to create the sense of self. And so what happens is that you have distanced yourself from what needs to be addressed, and it never resolves, and it's always there. You know, I really believe that in some ways, the definition of mindfulness that exists today, you know, it is very dependent on the time and the culture and the individual. And my own take of mindfulness is that it is not about just enhanced awareness. It is not about just relieving anxiety and stress. That historically, when mindfulness was talked about, there was a discernment capacity to it. What was present skillful, and how was I going to act skillfully? And I think that mindfulness is truly a process of understanding how we create our reality and how we are in relationship with it. That mindfulness is not freedom from pain and suffering, but it is the freedom to be with pain and suffering. And that it is very important to identify, I believe, the woundings and then begin to integrate them. And it is only through integration of the wounding that we begin to disidentify with the sense of self. And in beginning to disidentify with the sense of self, we then have the capacity to be present, not having to protect the self moment to moment, but we have the capacity to be present from an openness of heart and interconnectedness. And this is a long and slow process. And so the only other advice I would give to you is that things unfold so rapidly that the event comes, we make meaning out of it, we create a relationship, and we act. And then we know what happens. We're already all the way down the foxhole. What we're trying to do with mindfulness is, can we move that point of awareness back from action to intentionality of action? So that can we ask ourselves, I am going to speak now. I am going to act now. And the importance of asking the question, in service to who? Am I talking, am I acting to meet an unmet need? Or is this because it truly is an altruistic and moral behavior? Our intentionality is never pure. It's never 100%, I'm going to do this for you because I want to help. That often underneath it is, there is some element of self-need, but that's okay. I think as long as perhaps we operate with the 51% rule, it's all right. In other words, are we acting on behalf of other rather than meeting unmet needs a little bit more of the time? That's okay. So I see that we haven't any more questions, and we're almost at 8:30. And so I think maybe what I'd like to do, Alan, is I'll just summarize what I've offered tonight.
Good.
And so just to summarize and say, wait. Try and remember to use that word as a way of being in relationship with every moment. Wait. Can you create a mindful pause because you're unregulated by connecting with your breath or your body? 2, what am I thinking? You're trying to bring the smile to awareness. And the critical aspect is, by labeling your experience, you support awareness, meta-awareness, and disidentification. This is probably the simplest, easiest, most direct and effective tool to support your practice of mindfulness. And what you want to do is to name the process, knowing fear. What am I touching? We need to have embodied engagement. We need to be in connection with what our body is feeling, because our body is communicating to us what our thoughts are, what our emotions are, what our held trauma is. And I think the important part about embodied engagement is to not just put our toe into how we feel, but to immerse ourselves totally in the water. In other words, allow ourselves to feel totally what is present and sustain the sensation until stillness and silence. Why am I thinking this? The important aspect of discernment, to understand why we do what we do, to understand that the sense of self has no enduring characteristics to it, that it is a temporary, constructed structure that is built moment to moment in an attempt to meet our unmet needs, and that its foundation is our psychosocial wounding. And what are we trying to do? That we are trying to be in a relationship, not with the moment, but with our sense of self that brings awareness, insight, and compassion to it, such that we act from a place ultimately that is beyond the defended ego, that comes to it from altruistic behavior, interconnectedness, and morality. And that by creating a formal practice of identifying one's belief system, what actually happened, what does this mean about me, and why? And then to visualize someone you care deeply about, who is the essence of yourself, and allow their pain to touch your heart, and then open up this compassion and love for self. So I want to thank everyone for being present and for listening, and for Katie's tech support, and for Alan's very helpful moderating support. Thank you.
Thank you once again, everybody.